Welcome to everyone who is logging on Zoom. We'll take a minute or two to let people get connected. Please feel free to write your name and where you're from in the chat, what organization you're with, if you're affiliated with a faith community or an interfaith group. We're very happy to have you all here. We'll get started in just a minute. Okay, I'm going to get started with some of the introductions. My name is Geneva Blackmer. I am the interim director for the Interfaith Center at Miami University. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization that seeks to unify people through relationship building, dialogue, and social action. And I'm very happy to welcome Stephen Andrews here with us today. Stephen is the author of That's Me in the Closet, a Spiritual Memoir. He is a queer neurodivergent person who has survived complex trauma and who has lived a spiritual journey from atheism to agnosticism to spiritual but not religious to becoming a pastor in the Presbyterian Church, USA. I welcome you all now to join him in conversation about his story, your story, and how we can collectively work to create spaces for authenticity and inclusion in the Church Universal. And with that, I am going to turn over to you, Stephen.
Well, hello everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I wanted to start out this presentation by talking a little bit about who I am and about the story that I share in the book, and a few stories that aren't in the book as well. And then I'd like to, hear some questions at that point and kind of clarify, whatever sort of points of the narrative don't seem clear at that point, or if there's anything I can kind of elaborate on further. And I'd like to conclude then by sharing a few thoughts I have on kind of the future of the church from the perspective of someone who, as a pastor, has been very much an insider, but also someone with a variety of identities that have kind of put me on the outside as a bit of an observer as well. So I wanted to start out by telling you a little bit about my story. And this is kind of what that story is in broad strokes. So when I was a kid in Columbia City, Indiana, I was subject to neglect from 0 to 3. I had a dad who so he stayed home on disability, and my mom was working as a registered nurse. And while I was home alone with dad during the day, dad would put me down for my afternoon nap and then go off to be with his girlfriend in the afternoon. And when my older sisters, who were younger elementary aged, came from school, they knew it was their job to take care of the baby. So that was kind of an early experience of neglect that, obviously I don't have memories of that time, but I know ways in which that experience impacted me. And that's certainly something that I explore in That's Me in the Closet. From age 3 to 6, there was a period of what I would call broadly kind of chaos and abuse that I experienced. Where we went from there was My mom made the decision to pursue a master's in public health out of state. My dad wouldn't give permission for her to leave the state with me and my older sister. And so we wound up living with my grandparents for a year and a half. They filed for custody of us about a year and a half in and said that my mother had abandoned us. That led to a court battle. In the middle of it, my mom got remarried, and even, as she remarried, my grandparents kept pressing the case, and my mom's lawyer advised her to move somewhere remote. She suggested either London or Hawaii. And my mom, being a registered nurse, she could find a job pretty much anywhere she wanted to. And so she found a job in Honolulu. And off we went to Hawaii when I was 5 years old. One of our sort of favorite family stories, just to go into the more lighthearted aspect of things for a bit. One of our favorite family stories from when I was 5 and going through kindergarten in Hawaii was that my mom got a call a little bit into our time there from the teacher that said that I had failed a test on the colors. I didn't know my colors. And my mom comes in for this conference with the teacher, and she looks at the sheet of this test that I failed. She says, "Well, ma'am, these are in Hawaiian." And the teacher says, "Well, ma'am, it's just review." And she was like, "Hey, he doesn't speak Hawaiian." So fun little jaunt in the tropics for a year. But Hawaii was also a place of a lot of pain for me. That was a place where my stepdad really kind of came into his own as an abusive figure. And part of why we were there for such a short time, we were there for 1 year and 1 day exactly. Part of why we were there for such a short time was that he was highly abusive on almost every level toward pretty much everyone else in the household. And as a result of that, foster care was the next step for us. Um, Interestingly, we were in foster care in a small town in Ohio called Wickliffe, which is right outside of Cleveland. I don't know if any of y'all know that town or not, but my mom had some old friends there, a Lutheran pastor, a Missouri Synod Lutheran pastor, and his wife, who was an RN, who my mom had met in her work stint out of state, and we went there to stay for a while. And I mean, we were picked up by the state at that point because we'd been through an abusive situation. We'd been on the radar of Hawaii CPS. We had left the state while we were still under scrutiny from the authorities. It was not a good looking situation at all. So I experienced 2 years of foster care when I was in the end of first grade and then through second and third. And then in fourth grade, we have a relatively normal upbringing in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And I say relatively normal because by that point, um, I am so scarred from the experience. My family is so scarred from the experience. I have an older sister who's 5 years older than me, and she came out of everything we went through as children feeling very angry, justifiably so. She was really the person who stepped forward as the protector, as the one who would shield me from things that were coming my way at times. And so she had a lot of anger in her. And my coping mechanism was to kind of hide and ball up and try not to be seen as much as possible. And I mean, that's not entirely healthy for a coping mechanism either, but it's slightly more socially functional because you can be a person who tries to hide, but also still, do pretty well in school and do a lot of things that are expected of you well. So we had, some relative stability at that point, but nothing was normal. I remember when I was in fourth grade, I remember a incident where I was on the other side of a movable wall from two of my classmates, and I overheard them talking about me and saying, "Yeah, I just don't understand why he's not cool, you know, like he dresses the right way, you know, he's funny, but they said, and there's just something about him. And there's just ready agreement, like, yeah, there's just something about him. And that was, you know, something that was kind of ingrained in me at that point, that I'm just not a normal person. What I always attributed it to was, you know, having gone through these experiences these first 8 years of my life, having been neglected, having been abused, having been, you know, having had these experiences where I had to learn how to cope with it in some way, that, you know, perhaps I came out of that as someone who just wasn't relating to other people socially the way you'd expect someone to. I'm going to talk later about autism and my experience with that. I now understand my story to be one that involves both complex trauma and the after effects of it, and this neurological condition. Um, and I now see how those two both played a part in developing particular coping mechanisms, and, you know, having this particular experience of complex trauma and responding to it the way I did. Um, but certainly by the time I was 9, I was very aware that, like, I've been labeled as an abnormal person by the people around me. I feel abnormal. I feel like I don't fit in. And I kind of, in almost every setting I've been in, I've kind of always felt that, like I'm a fish out of water no matter where I go. Um, and you know, after a while, that just gets to be okay, because it's kind of fun to be a fish out of water. But that's been my experience. Um, I went to college at Wabash College in Crawfordsville, Indiana. Wabash gets a big shout out in my book here. That's me in the closet, Spiritual Memoir. Um, because that is also the place where I became a Christian. I was really raised atheist and was a college convert to Christianity. And I actually picked up, so I went into Wabash knowing that I was going to be an English major because I loved literature, I loved creative writing. But I also became a Christian around my sophomore year and made the decision to go ahead and pick up a religion minor, because I thought, well, you know, I've adopted this new faith. I want to learn some more about it. And so that was part of my experience. After college, I went back to Fort Wayne and worked in community corrections. I was a GED prep and English as a second language teacher for adult ex-offenders on home detention, probation, and parole. And then I attended Columbia Theological Seminary near Atlanta, Georgia. And since then, I've worked as a chaplain, a pastor, and a therapist. That's kind of the broad strokes of who I am. But I want to get into a little more detail. So I've already talked a little bit about never being normal after foster care. Um, and we're going to still peel back some more layers on that. I came out as bisexual in ninth grade. That was when I felt confirmed that, yes, I'm attracted to people of all genders. I think that, so in ninth grade, that was 1997 for me. I think that if the word pansexual had been part of my vocabulary at that point, I think that's the word I would have chosen for myself. And I think that may be true for a lot of bisexual people. And here I'm kind of veering away from my story a bit and getting into some sort of LGBT commentary. But both the word bisexual and the word pansexual started out as descriptions more of gender identities than as sexual orientations. The word bisexual was sort of coined around the 1910s as bisexualis, a sort of Latin sounding term that referred to people who exhibit characteristics of both genders, both male and female people. So it started out as a term talking about a gender identity. And over the decades, it became a term that people use to describe a sexual orientation, people who are attracted to both genders. As our understanding of gender has expanded over the years, we've introduced this term pansexual. That too has its own provenance. And you'll find some people who make a distinction between pansexual and bisexual, that bisexual is just men and women, pansexual is people of all gender identities. But most bisexual people I know, including me, are attracted to people of all gender identities. It's just that the term bisexual is the one, well, I'll just speak to my personal experience. It's just that the term bisexual is the one I knew when I was coming out in 1997 in Indiana. I didn't know the word pansexual, so that's just not the word that I knew. So it's a little bit of an aside there. As I said, I became a Christian as a sophomore in college. Um, After college, as I said, I worked for community corrections for a couple years, went to seminary. I married a woman that I met in seminary. We got married in Georgia. And moving from seminary into my career as a pastor, I mentioned before, like, going back to fourth grade, I sort of always knew myself as a person who was out of place, as a person who didn't quite fit, as a person who was kind of an outsider. And that's definitely been the case for me in my career as a pastor. So what I've done in my career as a pastor, after seminary, I worked in CP residency for a couple of years in Atlanta. I worked in as a youth minister. I've been a pastor of 3 churches. One was a rural church in Western Missouri. One was a suburban church right outside of Kansas City, Missouri. And then I was also the interim pastor of an urban, mostly African American church in inner city Kansas City. So 3 interesting church roles. Um, as a pastor, there were often times when I felt like I was ill-suited for the job. I felt like I wasn't reading, other people's cues the way that they wanted me to, and I felt like I wasn't responding to situations the way I was being expected to. And also, I was being placed in these institutions where, there's certain expectations about like what this institution is supposed to do and be. And I didn't really know that that the kind of vision that a lot of the church members had for themselves and for their institution was necessarily the vision that I saw myself living into as their pastor. And so I found myself as a pastor constantly dreaming of and trying to build the thing that was coming next in the church. So for example, I was pastor for 8.5 years at Parkville Presbyterian Church in Parkville, Missouri, right outside of Kansas City. And one of the things we did while I was there was we started a new worshiping community called the Parkville Living Center, which is a community center type space. We were able to start it using seed money from our denomination, as well as some other donor support. The Parkville Living Center started in 2020, actually May 2020. It sort of came out of the pandemic experience and kind of the desire to dream of a new thing while old things seem to be falling away at the moment. And the Parkville Living Center, after about 2 years, became an institution that could provide financial support for a full-time executive director who was basically acting as a community organizer. So within 2 years, starting out with some seed money from the denomination, this organization became a thing that was supporting a full-time staff member and was doing so based on, having attracted some donor support. The Living Center does a lot of community programming of like town halls with political candidates, from all parties. They do, various meals, big celebration on Thanksgiving Day every year. They've got arts and crafts fairs. regular programming of yoga, and they entered into a contract with the local senior services that's basically made them one of the channels that federal grant money is poured into for providing senior services in that community. So it's really kind of an interesting model for like, what can you do with church space when the church itself is not occupying that space, especially when it's not occupying that space any day but Sunday. The Parkville Living Center is this thing that, surprisingly enough, like actually generates revenue and generates community interest and like makes a name for the church within the community. And I was very proud to be a part of, that thing getting off the ground. As an interim pastor, so I was an interim pastor at Covenant Presbyterian Church in Kansas City, Missouri. That was a job that I took on for 1 year in 2023. I was in a space where I was completing a master's degree in counseling, and part of the end of that degree is taking on a 20-hour a week unpaid internship in counseling. And so I needed some part-time work to go along with that unpaid internship. And so I transitioned from my full-time pastorate in Parkville to being a part-time interim pastor at Covenant. And what was interesting about the Covenant experience was that in my year there, we were able to, as a church, enter into conversations with a nonprofit in our community that was looking for space. And in fact, they were looking for a substantial amount of space. And we were able to engage in a lease with them where they're going to provide about a third of the church's budget moving forward, as well as they provided a $50,000 renovation fee that would help the church kind of renovate its side of the building in preparation for that move. In addition to that, we also entered into a parish agreement with a similar church of a similar profile about 10 minutes from Covenant so that they can move forward with a full-time pastor who serves both churches moving forward. And that too, I think, is part of the work of like, dreaming of the next thing for church is, I think, really thinking about like, how do we use these spaces in ways that really serve our communities and in ways that serve our communities so well that they are willing to financially invest in those spaces. Again, we're going to talk more about that later. My book, That's Me in the Closet, a Spiritual Memoir, came out in 2023. I started writing it in 2021. Parkville was nice enough to grant me a sabbatical, even in the midst of pandemic recovery. And the idea of taking a sabbatical kind of took me by surprise, but when it was offered to me, I thought, well, I've got to tell them I'm doing something, so I'm going to tell them I'm writing a book. And, through the grace of God, it wound up actually happening. So praise God for that. By the time, by 2023, we'd kind of finished with the publishing process, getting it edited, getting it ready, and being able to release it in August of last year. I alluded to earlier wanting to have some conversation about the future of the church. Because that future looks different than the present, that led me to eventually seek education and credentials in mental health counseling. So in 2020, while the Parkville Living Center was starting in Parkville, Missouri, I was also starting a degree in mental health counseling, which I then graduated from in 2023. And I currently work as a therapist in a state prison setting here in Georgia. So to focus in a little further on LGBT identity and also on an autistic identity, so I would mention that, as I said before, I came out in 1997 when I was a freshman in high school. That was when it was clear to me that I am a bisexual person. I am generally thankful that I wasn't raised in a church setting. So when I got to be a ninth grader who wanted to adopt this identity, I didn't have any voices in my life who were telling me, well, maybe you ought to think twice about that, or maybe that's not really true for you, or maybe that's just the phase you're going through. I didn't have any negative voices at that time telling me to suppress that identity. And I think part of that is my atheistic upbringing. So I am kind of glad that I got to embrace that bisexual identity before I became a Christian. Um, I was closeted in high school. That didn't feel like a safe space for me. Um, but I was very open with a lot of the people that I knew online. I was open through college and young adulthood and seminary. As a young adult, I became an LGBT activist in the Presbyterian Church USA. I was a member of the board of That All May Freely Serve, which is a now defunct inclusion organization in our denomination. Um, I also attended our 2008 General Assembly as an activist for a group that we called the New Church Revolution, which was all about just like making LGBT activism a fun thing, making it a fun thing for us to work for inclusion, making it a joyful thing. You know, instead of it being this like hard slog of, oh, we gotta get in this fight so we can be recognized and all of that, we wanted to really bring in a group of young people who would have fun in that national church organizing space while we were debating these important questions and have that be a part of the atmosphere in which people considered LGBT inclusion in our denomination. As the years went on, I chose to return to the closet and participate in the phenomenon of bi-erasure when I became a church pastor in 2014. Bi-erasure, for those who aren't familiar with it, is a term that we use to refer to people who maybe you're a bisexual person in a same gender relationship, and people look at that and think of you as a person who's gay, and you just kind of accept that label that they've put on you that, yeah, I'm a gay person, and you don't really talk about your bisexuality. Or as in my case, you're in a relationship with a person of a different gender, and people are going to look at you and kind of code you as a straight person, and you just kind of accept that they're, you know, that they think of you that way. And so in 2014, I decided I think I'll just let people think of me as a straight person, and I think I'll just not talk about myself as a bisexual. I thought that my identity would be too complicated for many people. That sort of asserting, well, I'm a bisexual person, but I'm married to a woman, that would, people would have all these questions. Why is asserting that identity important to you? How is it that you're a bisexual when you're in this relationship? Does that mean that like, you want to have an affair? Like, I just felt like that was going to be too complex. And also that, in terms of looking at churches where I might serve as pastor, there would be you know, churches who were very progressive and already accepting of LGBT people would be perhaps excited for me as a bisexual candidate. And churches that weren't accepting would probably, you know, put me aside right away. And I thought, well, if I'm a straight presenting person who just doesn't talk about this part of myself, then maybe I can potentially be in more moderate spaces where I could maybe do some good and work for inclusion, maybe in ways that people um, in ways that people are needing in spaces where it's needed. Um, in 2023, I came out again with the publication of my book. And in my book, I really explore like that history with bisexual identity, including the participation in bi-erasure, because it's an important part of my story. Around the time that the book was coming out, and really too late for me to really include it in the story, I self-diagnosed as an autistic person. Part of my story with autism is that my 9-year-old son has a formal diagnosis of autism. And I've always been aware of myself, as I said before. I've always been aware of myself as a weird person. I've always been aware of myself as a person who socially and emotionally maybe isn't responding to the cues around me the way that people are expecting me to be. And I always thought that that was just about the complex trauma, that that was just about my experience of neglect and abuse and foster care and how I coped with that. And what I realized seeing my 9-year-old son develop a lot of the same traits I had, but without the complex trauma, was really eye-opening. Like seeing those traits develop in him made me realize that there's probably more to my story of like how I became who I am and why I am the way I am. There's probably more to that than just the experiences I went through. There's also, something about kind of the way I was coded by my genes way back at the beginning. And so I don't, quite frankly, I don't have the money to go out and get a formal diagnosis of autism, but I've got it. Um, so just to speak about that a little bit more. So the language I have listed here on the PowerPoint largely comes from the DSM-5, from the American Psychiatric Association's guide to how we diagnose a mental health condition. The DSM-5 talks about deficits in social emotional reciprocity, having an abnormal social approach, having a failure to initiate or respond to social cues in the ways that people are anticipating. It talks about having a deficits in nonverbal communication behaviors. Um, talks about having deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. I think if I were on the DSM-5 committee, I'd like to change each of the times it uses the word deficits, I'd like to change that maybe to challenges. Challenges in social emotional reciprocity, challenges in nonverbal communicative behaviors, but that's the language they use. I've also experienced very much attachments to routine and hyporeactivity in regard to temperature and other stimuli. Um, some of the ways that that's manifested as a pastor. So, for example, I have so often gotten the feedback, especially early on in my church career, that I was not being very emotional when I was up in the pulpit and offering a sermon. And I would think to myself, well, how can that be? I'm like putting all of myself out here and I'm like really letting it go. And people are telling me that, I'm not showing my passion and I'm not showing, the love that I have for people. And I'm not, they would say I'm not modulating my voice enough. I'm not changing my intonations enough. And I'd say like, I don't understand this feedback because I am so doing all of those things. And eventually I had a good preaching coach who like walked me through some videos of myself and showed me some different things I could do. And of course, this was all before I had an awareness that autism could play a part in that. But I did start to learn as a characteristic, how I could bring more hand gestures into it, how I could vary my voice more, and how as a learned behavior I could kind of meet people's expectations more from the pulpit. So that was one way that autism sort of manifested itself in the church setting, was having to learn how to kind of inhabit the role, I suppose. I very much remember when I was at Parkville Presbyterian Church, there were several instances where I was missing social cues from people in the church. And one in particular that always sticks in my memory is that I had a person who was undergoing dialysis treatments, not at like not at the particular moment that I was talking to her. We were just talking, on a Sunday morning at Sunday school. But I had a person who was undergoing dialysis treatments as part of her life. And the way she was talking about it, she had a smile on her face. She was kind of laughing about it. And so I thought, okay, this is something that we're having fun with. And so I kind of followed along with what I thought was that cue. And it turned out that she was deeply offended and felt that I was insensitive to the pain that she was experiencing. Um, I think one thing that's kind of interesting in talking about these experiences with autism is that, you can always look at it. You can look at every single thing that I would bring up as sort of everything that I might bring up as a manifestation of, or potential manifestation of the condition. You could say, well, that's just normal. Everybody has to learn how to preach. Everybody has moments where, people feel like they're missing them, or you feel like you're missing people. Everybody has to learn how to inhabit the role. But it's part of a pattern, you know. I would often have the experience when we were in board meetings of um, there being cues around the room that conflict was happening, but they were so subtle that I didn't recognize them. And after the meeting, my music director would come to me and say, well, did you notice how this person said this? Did you notice how this person did this? Like, he was showing me these cues that conflict was happening that I was just totally missing. And I thought everything was fine. And again, you could sort of look at those situations and say, well, maybe I was the perceptive one, and maybe my music director was being paranoid. Except I know from later meetings when those conflicts came out in the open and were not subtly, were not offered in subtle ways, but in open ways, that yeah, he was right about those situations, and I was the one who was missing the cues. Um, One thing I would say, I feel like in our common social dialogue, there's often a sort of misunderstanding of autism that, in sort of describing the characteristics of it, people will say things like, well, that just sounds like you're describing a shy person. I mean, that's just what shyness is like. Or that just sounds like you're describing an eccentric person. That's eccentricity. And I don't want to pathologize, being an introvert or being someone who's a little bit weird or offbeat. Um, I think the big difference is an autistic person experiences overwhelming sensory, overwhelming, um, an autistic person has overwhelming sensory experiences that then contribute to them missing the social cues and being people who are odd. Like it's sort of rooted in, there's a thing that's happening in my brain that is conditioning, how I react to the temperature in the room, how I react to the things that I'm feeling, how I react to things that I'm seeing. And it's that sensory overwhelm that then contributes to these sort of manifestations of, the social awkwardness, the miscues, things like that. And that's really what makes the difference between being autistic and just sort of being an introvert. Um, Now, I would say, in addition to some of those sort of negative examples of what it's been like to be an autistic pastor, I would say there's also some positive examples as well. For example, my sort of dual identity as someone who, A, was not raised in the church and doesn't necessarily have a sentimental connection to, this is the way church has to be, but also just kind of being a generally kind of offbeat person and having that sort of analytical autistic mind, really helps me to look at like church structures, church ideas about how we do church, and how all of this is patterned together that have allowed for a kind of creative eccentricity in pastoring, where, I've had an openness to really kind of not just having new ideas, but really like trying them out and forging them and trying to do new things. And I would say also that sort of that general experience of kind of having always been an outsider has made me a really good pastor toward other people who are marginalized in some way. Um, whether that's, people who are marginalized due to, racial and ethnic identities, language differences. I've always kind of been a person who is sensitive to who's not fitting in, who's not being included, who are we not talking to, and wanting us to push the boundaries of who we are as a community. One of the manifestations of that in my ministry has been that some of the demographic groups who have been most attracted to the ministries that I've offered over the years have been lonely old men who have, over the course of their lives, alienated their families and lost a lot of friend connections and somehow found their way to the church that I was leading nonetheless, and found in me someone who, would talk to them, someone who would treat them as an equal, someone who would appreciate them, and they in turn would become connected to the community that I was a part of. Um, having, I moved from Kansas City to Atlanta in January, and I've got a couple of those lonely old guys that I'm still in touch with because over the course of my time as a pastor, I became part of their support network in ways that couldn't necessarily be replicated just by, the next person who happens to fill the role that I was filling. One other thing I would say is that, being a pastor as an autistic person, one way in which the autistic identity is helpful is that autistic folks really seek out patterned social interactions where we understand how the interaction is supposed to go because I have a defined role and you have a defined role. And because there's those definitions in place, we can speak to each other in ways that hopefully are freer. And so having a defined role in a community where, you're you're the person who knows the theology, you're the wise person, the sagely person who's going to share their knowledge. Um, it's helpful as an autistic person to have those defined roles. That helps us with sort of overcoming some of the difficulties in social engagement. Um, so I think at this point I want to pause and ask for clarification, ask for questions and clarifications, thoughts, points of connection. I realize that, I've got a pretty complex story. It touches on a lot of different themes. There might be a variety of connecting points that folks have thought about as I've been talking. And so I'm just curious at this point, is there anywhere where you'd like some clarification, anything you'd like to hear more about, or any points of connection that you want to lift up?
Please feel free to unmute yourself or to share any comments in the chat as well. David?
Yeah, I haven't heard you talk about the future yet. Or if you did, I missed it. You mentioned how you see the future differently. Oh, there you go. Sorry.
That's on the next slide. We'll get there.
Okay, cool.
Any
Anyone
others?
else?
Geneva,
Yeah, Mark.
I'll jump in. Stephen, I'm so grateful that you're presenting your story. I mean, you and I have known each other for a long time since we were in seminary together. And one of the things that really struck me as I was listening to your story, I really appreciate the sharing that you've done about your experience learning about yourself, particularly the autism piece of your story in a ministry context. And it not only resonated with me to hear that, but it also got me thinking how much that we as churches have a lot of learning to do in terms of recognizing and caring for folks in our community who do live with autism or other diagnoses like that. And it strikes me that we all probably have a lot of blind spots when we come to that. And if we have blind spots around clergy that have autism, that means we probably also have blind spots with people sitting in the pews with autism. So I think it just raises an important reminder for all of us that this is it's part of a much larger conversation that's certainly not going to go away for churches. And I think it's really or all faith communities, not just Christian ones. And I think it's important for us to continue to lean into that learning so that we can all care for each other better and more clearly.
Yeah, thank you for lifting that up. Well, with that said, I'll go ahead and move on to my next slide, the future of the church. So in talking about sort of where I see, the church going from here, I would root the conversation in an idea that I'm sure is familiar to many of you, which is that, we have in the American landscape different kinds of churches based on different responses to the Enlightenment. That, there's that stream of thought that said in response to the Enlightenment, we have our evangelicals and our fundamentalists who said, well, you all are, striving for this kind of scientific rigor in how you pattern your thought. Well, we're going to apply scientific rigor, or at least our version of it, to how we read the Bible. And that's going to lead us to, these particular readings of the text that we're going to claim as traditional. What's fascinating to me about the evangelical or fundamentalist sort of movement is that even as they are sort of claiming this kind of rigor as to how they read the text, they are also a socially reactive movement that sort of longs for, what they would characterize as more traditional values. And so they find ways to read those values onto the text in ways that really defy the rigor that they claim in terms of how they read the text. And so at one and the same time, you've got this idea that, we're fundamentalists or we're originalists or however they describe themselves, but we're people who read the text more closely. And even if the text says some things that, maybe defy our particular ideas about how social lives ought to be patterned, we're going to sort of manipulate the text so that it lifts up, these kind of socially reactive values that we have. And so in being both a social and a religious movement, there are sort of these contradictions that are inherent in that setting. Nonetheless, in terms of sort of what those churches are like and what the future is for them, they've obviously carved out a space for themselves where, anyone who is desiring to sort of be in a socially reactive environment, where they are striving for, reclaiming something from the past that was lost, they are going to find a home in that church. And as an institution, they are going to be viable because they've carved out that space. And I find myself thinking about, in Scotland, the Presbyterian churches are a lot more conservative than they are in the United States, because in Scotland, you have a more liberal society, and the church became sort of a bastion of, that's where the conservatives go. That's where they find their community. And I think similarly, our evangelical and our fundamentalist churches, have a place on the landscape as places that people can go to if they're looking for kind of a reclaiming of an imagined past, or a simpler version of the answers, kind of the ultimate questions. We've got very simple, black and white, easy to understand answers. If you're a person who wants, if you're a person who wants simplicity in your messaging and your ideas, they're going to be able to offer that to you. we have, in my denomination, the Presbyterian Church USA, in other mainline denominations, Lutherans, Methodists, others, we have a different response to the Enlightenment. One that said, we're going to embrace new ideas. We're going to embrace science. We're going to think differently about the world. We're going to try to incorporate these new movements and culture into who we are as a church. And sort of as the Enlightenment became a period of history, and we now find ourselves in maybe a more postmodern space, although you could certainly argue that we're now sort of postmodern, whatever label you wanted to apply to that. But it's certainly true that, we now live in this age where there's a lot of institutional skepticism. There's a high level of emphasis on personal exploration. There's a high value placed on authenticity. I can speak to particularly, I'm 41 years old. That makes me an elder millennial. And what's often been said about millennials is that we grew up being advertised to in ways that maybe some of the generations that are younger than us are experiencing even more than we did. So we've been subject to a lot of promotions throughout our lives, and we know what it looks like when someone's trying to sell us something. And so we place a pretty high premium on you just being genuinely who you are and relying on the authenticity of that. And of course, the institutional skepticism when it comes to being a church. I mean, we as churches have sort of relied on this idea that people are going to want to become members of the institution that we are, and then they are going to want to support that membership through substantial financial gifts that help to then support an overall structure of, let's say, having a building and having at least one full-time staff member, and having that full-time staff member be someone who is a religious figure who provides, commentary on sacred texts, who provides, leading rituals and ceremonies, who provides spiritual guidance and support. We sort of have this model that's based on the idea of, we're going to have a physical space that we own. We're going to have at least one full-time staff member who's devoted to primarily religious work. And we're going to support that by having people who formally join as members of a church and who, again, pay a substantial amount of money to support that membership. And what we're finding as we live in this contemporary age, whatever label you want to give it, is that certainly it's been my experience as a pastor, and probably a lot of y'all's experiences as well, that when younger people come to churches, they often don't join as readily. Maybe they are geographically mobile and not willing to kind of tie themselves down to a place. Maybe they just have that institutional skepticism that says, like, I don't want to put my name down and say I'm going to be a part of this. I want to stay on the outside. And whether they join or not, they typically, the statistics tell us they aren't devoting the same level of percentage of their income to supporting the church that previous generations did, even when those previous generations were younger. So it's not just a matter of, well, when those younger people become older themselves, they'll have a little more financial flexibility and they'll be able to support the church at a greater level. Younger folks just aren't institutional joiners in the ways that older generations were. And so, here we find ourselves in this space where, we as mainline Protestant churches who have had this sort of different response to the Enlightenment than the fundamentalist or evangelical movement, we are in some ways sort of well poised to speak to this contemporary age, to offer places where, yeah, be skeptical of us as an institution. Yeah, bring your questions about faith. We're open, we're inclusive, we're ready for you. But at the same time, we also are tied to these institutional structures that are built on financial structures that were built for an earlier age, and we've had difficulty processing the need for institutional shifts. To sort of tie this back to my story for a second, I very much think that it's part of my experience as someone who, again, wasn't raised in the church. And so I don't have these sort of sentimental attachments to, well, when I was growing up, it was like this. And so I'd really love for it to keep being like this. And also, I think that sort of experience of being a constant fish out of water leaves me always sort of analyzing the spaces I'm in and wondering, like, how is it working? How is it not working? What can we be doing better? And I think, we find ourselves in this moment, according to the Pew Institute for Research, there are 19% of the American population is religiously unaffiliated, but is not atheist and not agnostic. So in the most recent Pew survey, which is from 2023, 28% of the American population was religiously unaffiliated. 5% of the population was atheistic. 4% identified as atheists, 5% identified as agnostics. That leaves the full 19% of the population that is willing to tell a pollster we're not affiliated with any religion, but also we're not willing to claim that we don't believe in something. Like, we live in this wonderful age of spiritual exploration. Our liberal mainline churches are in some ways well poised to embrace that because of the ways we've responded to the Enlightenment. And we're in other ways not well poised to respond to it, because when people come to us with their exploration, with their questions, with their, hopes for the community, that the community might be a space where I can be fully myself, that the community might be a space where I can be open, that the community might be a space where I can bring all my eccentricities, we are also meeting them with the expectations of, we hope that you'll join us and we hope that you'll pay for that privilege. And so there's the contradiction that sort of lies at the heart of the mainline Protestant movement, that at one and the same time, we can be this open space, but also we're burdened by a structure that prevents us from being as open as we'd like to be. Mark spoke earlier about the idea of kind of being a space where people can be freely autistic. I think that we're limited in a lot of ways because we often will maybe think of our more eccentric members as, people who aren't contributing to the structure, aren't building us up financially, aren't helping us to support ourselves. And so maybe those are people that we want to minimize their role in the community. We don't want to move them forward in leadership. We don't want people paying attention to those people. We want, the folks who can help support us to know that they're welcome, that they've got a place here. And we maybe are going to put our priority on making sure that they find the openness that they're looking for, which I think is kind of a self-defeating strategy, because what you have in the end is sort of this declaration. Oftentimes in our churches, we have this declaration that all are welcome, but the actual experience people have is that I'm constricted here. I'm not able to fully be myself here. I can't do the exploration I thought I could do here. Because, again, of these institutional burdens. I think the way forward is to rethink how we structure ourselves. So again, drawing on my experience as a pastor, I found ways with the churches I was leading to utilize the church space to generate revenue in ways that were outside the stream of being a religious community. In Parkville, we established the Parkville Living Center as a non-sectarian community center. And we're able to both offer something of value to our community, and also to generate some revenue that contributed to supporting that building and all that it was able to offer to the people around us. At Covenant Presbyterian Church, the church where I served as an interim, we were able to be, a space that housed this big nonprofit. And also to kind of think creatively about what we wanted our leadership structure to be. And I think the future a lot is in that. And, I say that being very aware that what I'm essentially saying is that the training I received in seminary is maybe not the wave of the future. That the idea that we should have, people who commit 3 years to full-time graduate study and take on all of the sort of costs associated with three years of full-time graduate study. That's how we qualify someone for leadership in our community. I think the future is going to involve us rethinking that and looking more to models like our commissioned lay pastors, who maybe do 1 year of part-time preparation as their way of leading the community, and who maybe are bringing experience from other roles in organizational leadership and in sort of driving change within an institution because they picked up those skills in the business world and can bring them to the church. And I think that the wave of the future is maybe in a structure that doesn't rely on a full-time staff member who is a religious figure primarily. If I were to sort of restructure right from the start what I think a theological education ought to look like, I very much value my theological education. I love everything I learned and all the people I learned it with. But I also think that the future of the church calls for a lot more grounding in how organizations work, how organizational change happens, and how you can create a different kind of structure in ways that, there are templates to follow, but the way you do it in your particular community is going to be different from how someone else did it in their particular community. And I think we need to be creating leaders who have that kind of organizational agility as part of their skill set, in addition to theological thinking and ability to interpret the sacred texts. So I think to connect back to authenticity, I think as we rethink what the structures are, when we are less burdened by them, we can be freer to be ourselves, both as individual people and also as, institutions made up of individual people. I think that we can find our way to greater authenticity when we reimagine who we are and how we are who we are. And I'll just say for me personally, right now, I'm a recently graduated person with a master's degree in counseling. I pursued that education because I thought, there's going to be fewer full-time jobs in my denomination, full-time jobs with benefits. I should adopt a different skill set so I can do something else, maybe eventually in addition to ministry. What I'd love to eventually do is to lead a religious community that is sort of like a community center, that's mentally health informed, that does mental health gym type programming as one of the ways that it contributes value to its community. I'd love to kind of create a space for authenticity and creativity and also religious exploration, maybe as my contribution to this conversation of what the future of the church can be. So with that said, I'll go ahead and close there and open up for any other questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I know that a lot of people had to hop off exactly at 1 p.m. I got a lot of messages, but for those who are still here on the call, does anyone have any questions or comments for Stephen before we wrap up? Marcella?
Hi there. I'm in the store right now, so I've been listening to everything, and I just thank you so very much. This is also very affirming for me, because I almost feel like most of the things I heard is just as a reflection of similar experiences I've had, as well as background and ways to move forward. I would really love to connect with anyone else who has the same sentiment, because similar, I have tons of ideas and things. It's just like we need to work together. So I just want to throw that out there. Please be in touch with me, whoever. I don't know the best way to do that.
Amen.
Well, I'm happy to send a follow-up email to everyone who registered. And Stephen, if you're okay sharing, your email, if anyone wants to connect with you, perhaps that would be a pathway. And of course, Marcel, you're more than welcome to connect with me and with the Interfaith Center. I would love to center these kinds of conversations more. As Stephen has very eloquently pointed out, this is something that often gets overlooked. And I have a bit of a background in theology of disability as well, in connection with digital theology, actually. So yeah, I mean, we would love to have more of these conversations. So I welcome that, and I'm more than happy to send out some information about how you can get in touch with Stephen. The other thing I think we should mention is how can they buy your book? You haven't given us any information on.
Sure.
Stephen.
Yeah, so I realize I've got a blurred background, so I've been holding up the book and it's like still blurry. But no, the main space to buy my book is on Amazon. And again, it's called That's Me in the Closet, a Spiritual Memoir. And you see my name up there, and Amazon's probably the best place to get it. Yeah.
Okay, I will look that up on Amazon, and I will send a link to that in the follow-up email as well. Great. Were there any other final questions or comments?
I've got a question just about the book, actually, Stephen. I was wondering how was the journey of the publishing process for you? I was wondering if you could share a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. So I found myself, I've always wanted to write some kind of book telling my story. When I was in college, I studied creative writing. Coming out of college, I was accepted to an MA program at Ball State for creative nonfiction, and I didn't wind up going at the time. But I sort of always knew, like, I've got a story to tell, I've got a desire to tell it, and this sabbatical presented a wonderful opportunity when I was, I guess, 38 at the time, where I was personally developed enough to write it in ways that I really couldn't have at a previous time in life. Like, I tried writing it before and it didn't quite work. But in terms of publishing, I submitted to a lot of literary agents. They all turned me down. They didn't think that my particular book commanded much of a national audience. I don't have a big social media presence. I'm not a celebrity. They didn't really think that they could sell my book. And I think a lot of publishers felt the same way. The exception wound up being Resource Publications, a division of Lipf and Stock, which is really a particular arm of theirs that specializes in more literary type works and offers them in a way that essentially they print on demand. And so they're not taking as big of a financial risk on your book as a traditional publisher might. And so that wound up being my particular path toward publishing this work. I do hope to write a second one that is maybe a little more developed in terms of its ideas and in terms of what I'm hoping it to be. And I hope that I hope that this provides me with some credibility that I can bring forward into that second book and offer it in a more marketable kind of way.
That's awesome. Thanks, Stephen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question, Stephen.
Yeah.
Thank you, Stephen. It's great to listen to your experience, especially around your childhood, which was not that pleasant, and but you came out very positive, and you didn't let your past get on you. I can see you a strong man and very positive, and you have a bright future, my pastor. But I would like to know what is the feeling of your congregants, especially those who are radical, those who really don't want your status. How do you deal with them? How do you deal with your colleagues? Do you receive enough support from your church leaders? And do you feel really, really comfortable in your position in the society? Yeah, I'd like to know a bit of that because I'm from the Anglican Church in the Congo, and here, really, okay, globally, we have that issue of accepting and others not accepting the LGBTI community, but we have a lot of discussion going on here in Africa, especially in Democratic Republic of Congo, to see whether it's viable or not. There are a lot of discussions around that. What would you advise me as one of the LGBTI activists? How should I take the matter, especially in the lens of the church? Because they always come with biblical scriptures, and I'm not that strong in biblical scriptures. So what would you advise me to do? Thank you.
Thank you for your question, John. You're certainly in a challenging setting, and certainly it's a challenging space for everyone, and maybe particularly for LGBT people who, are subject to kind of the criminalizing of that identity, and obviously some very strong societal feelings that are rooted in a particular reading of the Bible. That they would say, that's a wrong thing to do, that's a wrong thing to be. I would say first and foremost, my basic way of sort of reading the scripture on same-gender sexual attraction is that yes, the Bible does condemn certain same-sex sexual acts, but it condemns it in a context of idolatry, in a context of people having relationships outside of marriage, or people having relationships between men and boys. They don't really do it in the context of people having loving relationships between consenting adults, because that really wasn't a reality back then. People didn't pattern their lives on having a homosexual identity or having homosexual relationships the way that they do today. And that has a particular history to it, which I realize we're over time, so I don't want to get fully into. But I would love for you to email me, and I would share some more resources. What I would say, though, as kind of practical advice as to how to respond to people is, part of your response, I think there's a way to argue it, to say, like, we read the scripture one way, but in its full context, it really doesn't condemn the kind of relationships that people have today. That's part of the response, but I think also part of the response, people's minds are generally changed by hearing stories. Like, it's not so much that, you told me an argument and I was convinced by your argument, so now I believe B instead of A. It's generally more often like, well, I met, Scott and John, and I see that they're such loving people, and how can God condemn that? And so I think really, to the extent that you can share stories of people engaged in loving same-gender relationships, that really is the way to help people come to a different understanding of what it is that God might want us to do in response to these kinds of relationships.
Were there any other final questions or comments? No? Okay. Well, I want to thank you so much, Stephen, for your time, for this wonderful presentation, for being so vulnerable with all of us and sharing your story. And yes, I see a request for your email. So yeah, feel free to put that in the chat, but I will also send it out to everyone who registered as well, along with the link to purchase the book and a link to the recording. So thank you all so much for participating in this conversation, being here today. And thank you, Stephen. If you had any final closing words, feel free to share them now.
I really enjoyed this conversation with you all, and look forward to connecting more.
Great. Thank you all so much. Have a good rest of your day or evening, wherever you are in the world.
All right, see y'all.